For some of you who are visiting today, I think I should let you know that we do not spend all of our time in this room. It just appears that way sometimes. And you may, on the tour of the new building that I think you probably took this afternoon, have seen the room in the new building that we were involved in designing the new building called the new 207. Because for those of us who don't think of this as the Jeffrey Cowan Forum, and don't tell Jeff I said that, we just call this 207. And in the new building, we have a room at the end of the ground floor, right next to the cafe, no coincidence, which was intended to be the room that we would use for the functions we have mostly carried on in this room, which, as you may have decided by the end of the day, isn't ideally suited always for these sorts of things. You know, round table, chairs, couches, or whatever. So there'll be a new room. Starting next year, these sorts of things will probably happen in whatever we end up calling that room. It is a naming opportunity for those of you with a great deal of loose change, or maybe some bitcoins that you can cash in for the purpose. So we have not coincidentally taken to scheduling this annual event on the same day that we invite those whom we hope will be joining us next fall in the doctoral program, in part because there are really some messages, dual messages, or more than dual. Come on in, there's more space up here. And one of the messages that we intend to communicate through this event is that there is life after the Annenberg. That our doctoral graduates, who are the students, I think it's fair to say in this company, I might not say it in all companies, are our most important product. They are the students whom we invest the most time in, the most resources in, the most attention in. Believe me, I don't say this to the undergraduates, or the students, but it's true. And in a very real sense, our doctoral students are the ones who become our colleagues for decades after. And one of the purposes of this annual event is to ask back one of our doctoral alumni to come and talk about work that they've done, and to sort of cement and reinforce the notion of continuity, of connection, of relationship between the school and our graduates. We have in the past drawn upon, and this is history you may or may not know anything about, but the current Annenberg School is the product of a merger between what we call the old Annenberg School and the communication program in the College of Arts and Sciences that were merged about, what? 94. And the doctoral alumni are, in many cases, from either one or the other program, although Greg represents one of the very first who finished just after the merger, so in a sense he is a product of this union between the two programs. Just think of that as a very good thing, and look at it. Bouncing, healthy, those two programs. Fruit I have no difficulty saying this, having arrived long after that union was consummated.
Apgar scale?
The second purpose of this annual event, and this I'm happy to say is the 10th Annual Walt Fisher Lecture, is for us to honor the numerous contributions and continuing relevance of the work of communications scholar, pioneer Walt Fisher, who is modestly seated in the back of the room. And as I know very well, reading the work of students here, someone whose ideas, whose contributions, whose theories are still very much alive and present in our curriculum. And when Walt retired, it seemed to be completely appropriate to identify this important event as representing the continuity of the academic mission and the academic life by recognizing his contributions with Walt Fisher Annual Lecture, and we're delighted that Walt is able to make it. This year's lecture, as I've already said, and as you know, will be given by Greg Dickinson and Randy Lake, who is sort of host pro tempore and co-teacher in a course this semester, will introduce him.
I'm going to steal the podium here for a moment because I did prepare a couple of things. Thanks, Larry, for this opportunity. I'm really pleased that I can say a few words about Greg. As you alluded to, he is in some ways the perfect speaker for this occasion because of the way that he embodies the history of our PhD program. And he also was one of Walt's students. And he became one of the first graduates of the current Annenberg doctoral program in 1995. I have some stories about those days. Unfortunately, so does he. In the terminology of the Cold War, this is known as mutually assured destruction. So I will spare you my stories, but if you want the skinny, see me later. Greg's dissertation, back in the day, entitled Landscapes of Memory, Landscapes of Consumption, the Rhetoric of 20th Century Urban Consumption, suggests his animating concerns. His work focuses on the ways that buildings and built landscapes engage communicative questions of belief, value, and action for those who live in or travel through these spaces. Examining diverse spaces from shopping malls to coffee shops to Western heritage museums, much of this work focuses on the intersections among rhetoric, memory, and place, which happens to be the title of the seminar that it's my privilege to co-teach with him this semester. As you can see, stand up, Greg, this joke needs a visual. Thank you. Greg is a scholar of considerable stature. You knew there would be a height joke. Come on. I especially like to tell height jokes when Professor Manji is present. What you can't see is that Greg is one of the most widely published, respected, and decorated communication scholars working on these issues today. His dissertation received the National Communications Association Gerald R. Miller Outstanding Dissertation Award. In 2011, his essay that was co-authored with his frequent collaborators Brian Ott and Eric Aoki, entitled Ways of Not Seeing Guns, Presence and Absence at the Cody Firearms Museum, received NCA's Golden Anniversary Monograph Award as the most outstanding essay published in the discipline the previous year. He is the editor with Carol Blair and Brian Ott of Places of Public Memory, The Rhetoric of Museums and Memorials, published by the University of Alabama Press in 2010, and with Brian Ott of the Routledge Reader in Rhetorical Criticism, published in 2012. He is currently completing a monograph entitled Suburban Dreams, Imagining and Building the Good Life, that will be published by Alabama next year. Along the way, he has received multiple teaching awards at CSU and recently served out his sentence as Associate Dean for Undergraduate Studies. His talk this evening is entitled Recollecting a New God, Bullocks Wilshire, and the Ambivalence of Memory. It is my honor to introduce an exemplary scholar, teacher, colleague, and friend, Greg Dickinson.
We can all just go now, I think, because I don't really know how to follow up on that lovely introduction. Thank you, Randy. And it really is an honor to be here at this moment of recruiting for new PhD students. Best of luck to you all. But I'm evidence that you can make it, even if you're not the brightest bulb in the light socket. It's really particularly an honor to be here in a lecture named after Walt Fisher. Walt was one of the reasons why I came here. I think that's probably true for lots of folks who came to Cass at the time, Communication Arts and Sciences, and then to Annenberg. I'd read his work as a graduate student, as a master's student. I cited it in my master's thesis on Ronald Reagan. I've clearly strayed from that political rhetoric sort of thing that I was doing originally. And took numerous classes from him, at least rhetorical criticism, rhetorical theory, and writing for publications, at least those three. And I remember writing for Walt and getting papers back from him that I thought I had done a pretty good job on because I was at USC. And it turns out that might not have exactly been true. It was true that I was at USC, but I might not have been good. This is what I remember. I'll come back to this before the presentation's over. This is what I remember. Whole sections gently marked out. And in the margin, written, homework. And at the time, of course, being tender, I was disturbed. But as I look back and think back on that, I think about how, in some ways, what a gentle thing to say. Thank you for writing all that. I appreciate that. You've clearly done a lot of reading, and I appreciate that as well. In the next essay, just remember that you've done that, but write something else. Fair enough. I frequently want to say that and worse to students that I now have. But the other thing about taking classes from Walt is I got here in 1990, and I moved here to LA from North Berkeley, and before that, after a sojourn one place or another, I was raised in a little tiny town called Walla Walla, Washington, in eastern Washington. And living on Vermont and 3rd in LA was a startling experience. It was not one that Walla Walla had well prepared me for. And so early in my career, I was thinking I was going to write about Reagan and Carter and political stuff like that. And I was in my neighborhood, and I thought, I have no idea how to live here. None of the resources that my parents had given me, as lovely as they are, as my upbringing had given me, teach me how to be here. And so I was in a class with Elizabeth Altman, and I said to her, I can write 2 papers. I can write a paper on mystery novels, which I read avidly, or I can write a paper on my neighborhood. I have an idea of how to write the first one. I have no idea how to write the second one. And Elizabeth, after a long pause, said, write about your neighborhood. And I said to myself, oh, sure. But I got intrigued. The next semester, I was in a rhetorical criticism class with Dr. Fisher, and I thought, I kind of want to keep writing about this architecture stuff. And so I went to him and I said, what I want to write about is a building that I see every day when I'm riding the bus to or from campus, a building called Bullocks Wilshire. I was interested in the 1920s as an historical time period. The building seemed quite wonderful. I'd never been in it. And this is what I imagine Walt thought. I don't know if this is true. He thought, you'll never publish that. Turns out he's right. I haven't. You'll never make a career writing about space and place. And yet, he said, give it a try. I'll do the best I can to help you write that paper. It became part of my dissertation, and I've published a couple things since. And so it's a real honor to be here to honor Walt and his contributions to the field and to my own life. So Bullocks Wilshire and the Ambivalence of Memory. I had kind of a couple fun experiences as I was putting this up. A couple of people came up and said, oh, I just love that building. So it's a building in LA that many people know and are familiar with, at least have heard of. So it's kind of fun to be able to talk about that. What I want to talk about today is Bullocks Wilshire at the time of its initial completion, the moment that it opened, 1929. So I'm not going to talk about how Bullocks Wilshire, what the work it does, rhetorical work it does in 2014, but rather in the late 1920s in LA. What I want to talk about is a relationship between memory and modernity that Bullocks Wilshire works hard to negotiate, and its success as a department store and as a building, at least in 1929, depended on this difficult relationship between modernity and memory. So, to do that, I want to spend a little time talking about the Rhetoric, Memory, and Place, the title of Randy's and my seminar. So that, because my guess is that we don't all have the same background for this, and so maybe I can just put in a little bit of background. And one last thing, when Randy helped me write my dissertation, he said this, when I'd finished the whole thing, he said, "This is all fine and well, thank you very much, where's the rhetoric?" And so I then proceeded to rewrite the whole thing, finding the rhetoric, and so here it is. I want to talk about three relationships, rhetorical relationships, around memory that help us be able to think about Bullocks Wilshire specifically, but also think as rhetoric scholars about memory and about place. And the first one is memory and place. All of you know, you don't actually, but some of you know, that the rhetorical tradition in ancient Greece and Rome, in particular Rome, came up with 5 canons of rhetoric. These are the things you need to know to do rhetoric well. And they are, I'm not going to call on anybody and have them tell me what it is: invention, arrangement, style, delivery, and memory, and in that order. So I just took that right off the top of my head there. That's pretty slick, I think. Memory is in there, right? And the point of memory in ancient Rome was that you don't have the kind of memory aids that we have available to us today, right? And so part of it had to do with memorizing your speech so that you could give your speech. Part of it, though, also had to do with the fact that you couldn't go to Google in Rome to find out the information you needed for your speech. In fact, you were going to have a hard time going to the library. We didn't even have library card catalogs at the time, and so finding information was a bit tricky. And so getting it into our head and keeping it there was really important for the invention of a speech, of being a public person. So memory served these two functions: the function of remembering the speech you're about to give, but also the function of remembering the materials you need to give the speech. And so they really thought a lot about how are we going to teach people to have this kind of memory. And so they developed, I won't tell you the story, the kind of mythical story of how this comes to be, but they develop what comes to be called an architectural mnemonic system. And what young orders were urged to do by people like Cicero and Quintilian was to go find a really compelling ruined temple, memorize all of the spaces in those temples, and maybe the first room of the temple maybe has 6 statues, and so you memorize that. You got this really compelling image in your head of this temple, and then you take the first thing you want to remember and you put it in the first room on the first statue, and the second thing you want to remember on the second statue, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is really powerful because then you just go back to the room, which you've already memorized, and in that room you'll find the memory. What's more, it's ordered, so that the first part of the speech is in the first room, the second part of the speech is in the second room. By the Middle Ages, and I'll come back to why this is the case, monks are memorizing the entire Bible this way. There's a wonderful book about a monk called Matteo Ricci who goes and tries to convert Chinese folks to Christianity, and he shows off his prodigious memory. He's memorized the entire Bible, and he can not only repeat to you, say, Psalms 27 from first to last, he can repeat it to you from last to first, because you just go to the later room and go backwards. It's extraordinarily powerful. So memory and place, they're connected. 2, memory and style. You're already beginning to get a sense that one of the ways of making our memories work is to connect the memory to something that's really compelling, to some idea or conception or image that's compelling. That image is going to bring it back. So one of the things that happens in the Middle Ages is that the medieval theologians begin to import ideas from the classical period, and they do that in ways to try to make them Christian. And what happens with Augustine and a few people after him is they import memory from Aristotle, because Aristotle has talked about the relationship between memory and right action. And so they import memory as a way of helping people understand how to be virtuous. And the moment they do that, people begin to think, maybe we can build images that can help people be virtuous, memory images. And so if you've gone to a medieval or early Renaissance cathedral and you see all those marvelous images in the windows and the carvings and the portals, these are memory images. They're trying to remind you of the stories of how right action works. And so memory and style get connected such that we begin to think about how stylized images can call forth memory. So I'm beginning to make a transition from a very technical notion of memory, I'll remember a space that I'll put memories in, and now I'm beginning to think about how can I build things or produce things that trigger memory. And that gets us to memory and identity. Let's go back to Greece. Plato argues that memory is the fundamental characteristic of identity. That, you all know this about Plato, so I'll just go real fast. Your soul has lived forever. It was always there, it will always be there. At one time, your soul communed with the gods. You screwed up, and now you're in the poor, sorry body that you have today. And what your soul really wants to do is get back to the heavens. How is it going to do that? It's going to do that by remembering the forms it once saw. They're all there in your soul. You've just forgotten them. So what you want to do is trigger those memories so that you remember it. So in the Phaedrus, as the lover comes upon the beautiful beloved, he can say to himself, either I want you right now because you're so beautiful, or as the good horse does, he has this image of the soul, it's 2 horses and a charioteer. The good horse falls back on its haunches, overtaken by the beauty of the beloved. And the lover, the good lover, sees in the beloved the little bit of the form of beauty, beautiness, that the beloved partakes in. The lover says to the beloved, in you I see a little God. You might try that sometime. Is that going to work out for you? Yeah. Memory and identity now get connected. And if you think about memory and identity getting connected, and you begin to think about the idea of building spaces and images, not simply so that I can place memories that I want to place on them to recall them later, but as actually calling forth those memories, now suddenly memory and place get connected for the purpose of building identity. And so we see, for example, in Renaissance Rome, the popes rebuilding Rome in its ancient forms, and what they thought its ancient forms was, to try to produce citizens of the papacy. Anthony Vidler talks about the early Renaissance Rome as the first tourist city for precisely this reason. You walk into the city and it helps you recollect the way the city was, the imperial power of Rome, and thus the imperial power of the Pope. But modernity does a number on memory. And I'm going to really go kind of fast on this, and so all of you will have all sorts of reasons why I'm wrong. I'm good with that. Scientific rationality. So one of the things that modernity says is that tradition, that's holding us back. Tradition is so yes, for generations we've believed the sun rotates around the earth. That's not good enough for us. And so there becomes this really deep critical reflection about traditional understandings of the way the world works, of the ways in which humans interact, and in place of tradition, a kind of a scientific investigation of how the world actually works takes over. You begin to really call into question in serious ways the ability of memory or tradition to suture us into life as it actually exists. One of the disciplines, I'm really going fast, I know that takes us on is the discipline of history, which claims to become the guardian of memory, but in so doing kind of destroys memory. So, for example, I tell a story about Dr. Fisher writing homework on the side of my paper. I don't actually know if that's true. I may have made that up later in my life. I'm really being serious here. So I'm hanging out with Carolyn Lamonda the other day, former graduate student here, also got a PhD from us, and we're at Vroman's having coffee in Pasadena, and I tell her this story, and she kind of looks quizzically at me. So history would say, let's go ask a bunch of people. Was this the sort of thing that Dr. Fisher regularly did? Let's go ask Dr. Fisher. Did you used to do that? You don't have to answer. And my memory of what happened could be destroyed, but that memory has been important to me as I develop both as a scholar and as a teacher. So living memory, Nora argues, sutures us into ways of being with other people that helps us build community. History as a discipline isn't particularly good at helping build communities, but memory is. And modernity begins to call into question the role of memory because of the very right-thinking concern about tradition. So we begin to get a real ambivalence about this. The third thing, taking a totally different leap, is urbanization. So by the late 19th century in America, and at least in Western Europe, we're primarily an urban country. People have moved from the hinterlands to the cities. And what that means is your identity is no longer based on your relationship to other people. It's based instead on the ways in which you can manage your identity in a new urban setting. T.J. Jackson Lears, I believe it is, talks about managing first impressions, right? And so consumer culture becomes very important, the ways in which you dress, the ways in which you walk. I think about Theodore Dreiser's wonderful novel. I happened to read a letter from Theodore Dreiser as I was doing work on Bullocks Wilshire. He wrote to Bullocks asking for how many copies of his book, American Tragedy, and one other book was selling in the process of getting ready to write Sister Carrie. I think of that as kind of the ultimate novel form of that, where Sister Carrie moves from the hinterlands of Illinois to Chicago, and she kind of builds her own life based on her ability to take on the gestures of upper-class women. Of course, it doesn't turn out very well for her, which is kind of his point. So urbanization really calls into question this ability to suture ourselves into living memory. And if that happens in urbanization in general, it really happens in LA in the 1920s. 1880s, LA is 11,000 people. By 1929, at the time of my study, it has 1.5 million people. In an era of rapid urbanization, LA is particularly rapid. But because it happens in the late 19th, early 20th century, LA gets built in a very different form than even Chicago. So we're talking about what this is. Bullocks Wilshire is right about here. This is what we now call MacArthur Park, but was then called Westlake. And this is Wilshire Boulevard, not yet with a bridge over the lake. The bridge gets built in the mid-1920s, opening Wilshire Boulevard all the way to the ocean. Bullocks Wilshire is here, and it becomes kind of the quintessential artery of LA. LA gets built in a moment of transportation technologies that radically transforms how you build a city. A city now doesn't have a center, and in fact, by 1920, LA had destroyed its putative center, the Pueblo, and replaced it with a tourist site, Olvera Street, just to give you a sense of how deeply rooted LA is in constant change. And Rayner Banham says that LA was built as a kind of instant. He's an architectural critic who wrote a very important book in the 1960s that still rings true. Instant architecture, and that LA was an architecture of movement. And it's horizontal movement across space, right? And so first the trams, right? The trolleys that get you up to Pasadena or to Glendale, those sorts of places, and then eventually the car. So LA, because it grows out of virtually nothing, it has no kind of story of its own to tell, at least an Anglo story of its own. I want to be clear about that. It has no Anglo story of its own to tell. Because it's built without a center, because it's built through these very technologies that are calling into question the possibility of community and tradition, it feels these problems in particular. Okay. Apparently I wanted to talk about all those things, and in fact I did. So there you go. Bullocks Wilshire, Cathedral of Commerce. So here's Bullocks Wilshire nearing its completion. So very early on, but Bullocks is already a department store in downtown LA. I'm going to forget, I think it's like 7th and Hope, or I don't have that exactly right, but downtown LA. Bullocks wants to build a new department store, decides to build it on Wilshire. And he has already, John Bullock already has this slogan that then gets put on the right over this door here. This is here. To build a business that will never know completion. Now, let's just do a little rhetorical analysis of this. This is a particularly modern invocation. He doesn't say to build a business that will never end, or to build a business that will always last. He says to build a business that will never know completion, that will always change. Right? It will never know. So he wants to be here forever, but he never wants to be the same. This building, so you've got this contradiction already built in, an alwaysness and a neverness. Pauline Schindler, at the time that the building was opened, writes this. Greece built temples. The Middle Ages built cathedrals. But we whose life lies not in worship but in producing and buying and selling build great stores. Right here in this quote is this tension. This in saying it's this memory function of calling up the thing that I wish to reject, but in calling it up, I am also accepting it at the same time. We do still need cathedrals. We'll just say we'll have stores instead. And my argument is that Bullocks Wilshire is a modern cathedral. In fact, one of the leading architecture magazines at the time, in a caption of the building upon its opening, called it a cathedral to commerce. And so that I took that as kind of my critical tool to get into this building. So it's a modern cathedral. And let me talk about that in a couple of different ways, and then I'll get into the cathedral sort of part of it. It's oriented to the car. It's the first building that's oriented to the car in this way. So this here is an image from, whoa, hang on. This is an image of the back, what you might call the back. This is Wilshire Boulevard. This is the parking lot. And this is really the way you're supposed to come into the building. And in fact, in 1929, you would drive your car up, you'd get out of the car, the valet would take the car away, you'd go get your stuff, you'd come back to the car would be delivered to you, and off you would go. In its orientation, it already says these modern forms of transportation are the key to understanding today's life. It's also built as an Art Deco department store. So on the porte cochere, I'm going to say that right someday, is this marvelous mural. And this mural signifies, it's called the spirit of transportation. There again is the ambivalence, right, between the always new and the past. That includes all these transportation images, dirigibles, airplanes. In other places there are steamships and locomotives. Conspicuously absent is the car because you drove up in the car, so you don't need that in the painting. But this is in kind of an Art Deco sort of style. Inside, in the sporting goods room, is this marvelous three-dimensional, very long installation called The Spirit of Sport. And one writer talking about this said, let me get this quote. The mural by Stojana, this one, The Spirit of Sport, which colorful and exotic as it is, creates an impression of limitless time and space. And later goes on to say, expressing in line and paneling about the room this is in, the spacing and a feeling of freedom, a nonchalant air embodies in its abstract forms and linearity today's freedom and exuberance. So there's this real sense that this is a building of the moment, a building of the present and the future. In its beautiful simplicity, one author wrote, the building marks the perfect expression of the day. And Pauline Schindler, who I've already quoted, wrote, in their work in Bullocks Wilshire, meaning the architects and the designers, they have done their generation a great service. She was given to slight overstatement. They have interpreted modern life in terms of a form. They've lifted it out of the agglutinations of the past. It really says that. They have made articulate and so communicable the fine, selective, rich asceticism of the new civilization, the luxurious simplicity, the honesty, the clarity. But Greece built temples, the Middle Ages built cathedrals. So it's also a cathedral. Oh, here we have the cathedral steeple. I was driving up north on the 110 today, and you can see it still to this day. Right here at USC, you can look over, and there it is, drawing you from the hinterlands, as the Gothic cathedral did, to itself, suggesting nothing so much as a cathedral. This mural that I've been talking about, the centerpiece of the mural is a representation of the Greek god Mercury, who is the god of transportation and communication, suturing then these modern transportations into ancient mythical stories. What's more, this mural is placed where the portal would have been on the Gothic cathedral, the portal which told you the first stories you needed to know to understand what was going to happen in the church. And so you have here. The structuring of modernity on a sacred tradition continues inside the building. After passing through the porte cochere, where that mural is, the visitor enters into a small narthex. The walls angling away from the door open out into the main room or nave of the building. The narthex houses the elevators, and the visitors are encouraged, though, to move into this long, tall, narrow nave. Eye and body are drawn into and through the room by its length, height, and brightness. At the end of the room are a door and a large window, which, like the rose window on many cathedrals, draws the eye and the body through the building toward that end. Like the porte cochere, this room suggests the cathedral form. On either side of the room, tall rose-colored walls rise up like to a flat gray ceiling. 3 tall light panels on either side extend vertically from the recessed display cases up to the ceiling and then turning into the ceiling itself, piercing these walls. Decorative lines of wood and bronze emphasize the verticality of both the room and the light panels. While the entering light is artificial, they appear to be natural. And they function as those in a cathedral, making the walls almost transparent. These walls provide a sacred space for visitors inside, sheltering them from the outside. Finally, the lights ask the visitors to note the verticality of the room, drawing the eyes up into the ceiling. While these lights replicate in many ways the aesthetic functions of cathedral windows, they do not provide the traditional moral stories. In the traditional cathedral, stained glass windows presented sacred stories of faith, illustrating the moral lessons to be learned in the cathedral. In Bullocks Wilshire, the specific sacred elements of the faith are displayed in cases, recessed into the walls just below the light panel. The display cases, lit from the inside, effectively extend the light panels all the way down to the ground. Inside were displayed perfumes and toiletries and the accoutrements of consumer culture. With consumerism as the new faith, it made little sense to merely display items visually, as in stained glass windows. Instead, the items must be within the customer's reach. They must be accessible, and they must be consumed. This was not a faith that asked only that the sacred relics be revered. They must also be bought and used. In the new religion of consumerism, the saints in the windows must go home with the worshipers. To look at the relics of the new religion was to learn its commandment, and its commandment was, buy me. The high ceilings and the narrow aisles of the first floor evoke nothing so much as a cathedral, writes S.E.S. Robin Abkarian, but for the lack of funds, I would have worshipped mightily at the altar of Estee Lauder. Abkarian articulates the contradictory forces of modernity, a struggle between structure and freedom, memory and modernity, embodied in Bullocks Wilshire. On the one hand, the building encourages the audience to feel the security and stability that comes with sacred space. The sheer size and immovability of the place, combined with the stability of the cathedral form, creates a powerful symbol inducing a sense of stability. Yet the religion of consumption demands constant change. Thus, the positioning of the sacred relics, the perfumes, and the toiletries is ironic. They are placed where saints would be in the cathedral, representing a long tradition, but these saints are transitory. What is on the shelf today must be bought and replaced by a new and different item tomorrow. This new God will be sold. Change is constant, stability is overturned. The only stability within consumption is the constant consumption of the constantly new. Hiding their own impermanence, the building and its relics convince the consumer of the rightness of the product to be consumed. The playing of this constant inability to fulfill desire, the goods of consumption masquerade as saints, assert the impossible stability and impossible beauty. As Baudrillard, in an early book, argues, if the object of consumption were truly right or truly beautiful, then the whole system would fall apart. He writes, truly beautiful, definitively beautiful clothing would put an end to fashion. The latter can only do nothing but deny, repress, and efface it, while conserving at every new outing the alibi of beauty. Fashion objects efface their own denial of beauty. Bullocks Wilshire's cathedral form as a structure on which these objects are hung and justified. Body and skeleton cannot function as a foundation, moment for beauty, for if it did, it would short-circuit the system of consumption. So, the perfumes replacing the saints of yore took on a mystical force of the saints. Like the saints, the objects of consumption provided meaning, even salvation in modern consumer culture. Though T.J. Jackson Lear suggests that the shift from consumerism produces a shift from salvation to self-realization, in fact, Bullocks Wilshire suggests that there's a fundamental relationship between those two. So doing, the building stabilizes the instability characteristic of consumption through linkage of tradition, while arguing for the efficacy of consumption as a means of salvation. Thus, the cathedral structures or gives place to the art of decoration. The rhetorical force of traditional forms undergirds modern consumption. The steeple announces the building as cathedral, drawing consumers, both physically and symbolically. The porte cochere continues to argue for the structuring consumption on the foundation of the cathedral, anchoring modern transportation into traditional mythic stories, whether classical or Christian. And the main room completes, or in Burke's term, perfects, the cathedral impulse. Bullocks Wilshire's success lay in its productive management of the tension between freedom and structure, modernity and memory. The negotiation turns out to be a negotiation between surface and structure. The surface is modernity, freedom, flapper. The structure is memory, tradition, and virtue. But the relationship between structure and surface is complicated. The cathedral form is unable to provide the final foundation for the objects of consumption. Indeed, the culture of consumption, which demanded constant change, undermines the possibility of the cathedral. At one time, the saints provided the reason, the structure for the cathedral. Now the cathedral provides the reason and the structure for the saints. In this reversal, the structure itself is left without foundation. The cathedral becomes unmoored by consumption. And in Karl Marx's words, all that is solid melts into air. Thank you.
All right, Walt, are you going to answer the question?
I'd just make a comment that if our dear friend had submitted this as a paper to me, I would not have written almost.
Thanks, Walt. That's a very kind compliment. I know it is. I'm going to take all of it. Thank you. Stephen.
Thank you. I've read bits and pieces of this before, but have not heard the whole argument, and I was quite taken by it. I wonder if you are looking for case studies of rhetoric of architecture and the moments of urbanization, whether you've given some thought to comparing this one to ballparks and athletic stadiums, which is very much the same thing. The crowds come into the city and take a residence there and move in from the farm, and they have new forms of entertainment and the growth of professional athletics. Think places like Wrigley Field in Chicago, and I've seen in San Francisco where I grew up, there was Candlestick Park, which was already imposed as a kind of a big real estate boondoggle, which actually had wind there that really you never had a good game. But they now have this Pac Bell Park right there in the heart of the city, and people love it, except for that it's a totally different kind of thing than the decades of nostalgia that they've invested in places like Wrigley Field and so on. And I wonder what you'd say about, if you compare this to places like that, ball fields and stadiums, or like we have our Rose Bowl and the Coliseum itself, and then compare that to what they're being replaced with, the high-tech skyboxes and all that stuff. What happens to memory in that transition?
Right. So I don't. It's a great question. I have a former graduate student of mine writing that dissertation. So you might chat with her. So one of the things that's happened. I'm just going to speculate here for a moment. One of the things that's happened. There was a series of ballparks, built way back in the day, like Wrigley Field, that the Boston Park. Fenway, thank you. You see how bad I am at this sports thing? Fenway that become kind of places of pilgrimage, and so you can really use this religious metaphor to kind of think about that. Then there's a series of ballparks that are built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that are kind of this modernist, without any sort of memory. And then you begin to get what's the ballpark in, like, I think it's Cleveland, that was one of the first that are kind of in this nostalgic sort of mode. I think of the ballpark near my hometown, Rockies, where the Rockies play, Coors Field, and they really begin to build in kind of a late modern sense of memory into that to try to recapture that. Those are often also located downtown to kind of as part of a gentrification of those sort of places. So I think this kind of notion of thinking about ballparks or sports facilities as rooted in memory or trying to root themselves in memory, I think can be really powerful, as well as the kind of ritualistic sort of returning to them. All of that said, I've not done the study, so I'm purely speculating.
One more very quick comment on that. There's something that happens when these newer parks like Candlestick Park and Dodger Stadium they're imposed on these places and they erase the memory of the people who lived there
absolutely.
before. So what
Absolutely
happens to Chavez Ravine? Those memories are still out there.
Absolutely right. And one of the things when you write about space and place, is that memory becomes a really difficult thing to kind of get after, in part because every time the place changes, you kind of lose that, you lose all but the traces of those previous places, or they often try to hide the changes. And so then there becomes this kind of loss of memory in the building of new memories. I think that's absolutely the case. I got a couple of hands there. Chinatown, yeah, there are tons and tons of examples of that, yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right, and then we'll go back, yeah.
That was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
so
Yeah,
much. It was
I had
really,
fun.
It was really great. And I kind of wanted to ask you just a question to bring together some of the two references that you brought in your talk. One is Sister Carrie, and the other is T.J. Jackson Lear's The Notion of Salvation as Self-Realization. And I think that you are, to start with the latter, I think that you're right that salvation, it's not so much as Jackson Lear talks about, that salvation becomes self-realization within consumer culture, but that self-realization actually is salvation.
I think that's exactly right.
And he talks about, in that article, he talks about preachers who are effective preachers precisely because they are ad men, right? Or they are PR men, that is their second career, so that they can sort of evangelize in a way that is about selling God or whatever, because they were ad men or PR men. Dreiser and Sister Carrie talks about the subjectivity of the feminine subject coming to realization in a department store.
Yes.
There's no surprise that he wrote to Bullocks Wilshire or Mr. Bullocks or whatever.
John Bullock.
Right, okay, so I'm sorry, I don't know what his name is. So my question to you is have you thought of this? I think this is a really, really fantastic understanding of memory and place, but have you thought about the way in which gender plays a role in the department store?
Absolutely.
Which,
Right. So one of the pieces, I hate the maneuver I'm about to make. I left that out. I did. That's also a part of this argument. So one of the arguments I try to make in this paper is to talk about the contradiction, the rise of the flat. Two things: the rise of consumer citizenship and how that was the way in which women got integrated into modern citizenship broadly. And I've written about that a little bit in one place or another. Victoria Di Grazia, I think, talks about that, right? So the kind of, and part of that has to do with here's a place to get into the public sphere, which is the department store. But then there's all this language of democracy around consumer culture that's offered to women in particular as a way of expressing your enfranchisement. Vote for this hat. I mean, the ads are like that, right? So it's July 4, express your freedom, get this hosiery, right? Now, that's offered both to women.
That's always how I want to express my freedom.
Exactly. That's offered to women, but it's also offered increasingly to us just broadly as kind of what citizenship is through consumer culture. The second thing is that the kind of feminine subjectivity most closely associated with Art Deco is the flapper. And the flapper has a series of citizenship issues, sexuality issues that are really compelling, but there are also a series of films at about this time that offer, and you know this literature better than I do, so just correct me, offer the image of the new woman. And the new woman takes on some of the trappings of the flapper, but keeps the moral certitude of the Victorian woman she's replacing, just like Bullocks Wilshire. So Bullocks Wilshire offers this new kind of decoration, but wants to try to suture it into a tradition. So that's exactly the argument I try to make there. Can I come back briefly to the preacher and self-realization? In the Suburbs book, I write about megachurches. And megachurches are suburban, broadly, not exclusively. I was talking with somebody about the megachurch in Houston, which is urban, Joel Osteen's, but nonetheless. Suburbs today are almost exclusively spaces of memory, so lifestyle centers, like the redevelopment of the mall in Pasadena, are really kind of about memory. Chain restaurants are about memory. Olive Garden, the memories of our Italian past, blah de blah. Mega churches are profoundly a memory. They look nothing like anything but a bad mall. And mega churches are the kind of result, in some ways, of this, right? Where salvation increasingly becomes defined as self-realization, what Dana Cloud calls therapeutic culture, right? Where the placing of salvation and political culture is increasingly in the family. It's around kids. Lauren Brillant's written about that in a different sort of way. Yeah. And so we see kind of the result of that. And in fact, many of the preachers in megachurches have conversion experiences. They're marketers for Microsoft, and they have a conversion experience, and they open a church. Yeah, I got a hand here, and that. A whole lot less money. Yeah, well, maybe I don't know, right? I got a hand, and then a hand. Yeah.
So I thought of another structure that was built roughly around the same time, about 2 miles west of Wilshire, which is the Wilshire Boulevard Temple, a synagogue that was built around the same time and has very similar murals. And actually, I wondered, do you know if any of the murals were Hugo Ballin? I don't know. But anyway, these murals that were commissioned by a Hollywood set decorator, commissioned by the Warner Brothers to create a home for the new Hollywood Jewish upper class in LA, and it wound up being kind of the birthplace of kind of reform, modernized Judaism. And it's actually, if you guys don't, for those of you who don't know, it's shocking to have representational images in a synagogue because of the whole created images.
Second Amendment.
But the argument that my friend Mackenzie Stevens, who's in the art history department here, has made about that space is that it was a synagogue that represented not just modernity but also Hollywood and the film industry. And so I'm curious, in thinking about the idea of Bullocks Wilshire as a cathedral calling out from the hinterlands, this idea of this multi-sited, decentralized cathedral city. And if you thought about putting this in conversation with the other structures, even on the Wilshire corridor.
Right. So if I were to, it's a great idea, and in fact, there are a couple of really wonderful Protestant cathedrals right in that neighborhood. Some really wonderful examples from before Bullocks Wilshire was built, and so one could put it in conversation with other things. What I actually, I'm not saying that that's a bad idea. I think it's a great idea. What I would, if I were to expand the study, I would put it within the context of all the parts of the immediate neighborhood. So ask the question, how does this interact with the residential architecture of the time? How does this interact with the park? And how does it interact with the street? How does it help us understand the street? So I think that idea of moving out from a single building as kind of the text, so this is a very kind of textual sort of approach, to kind of moving out to bigger understandings of place and space, I think could be really productive for this, and is one of the things I'm kind of thinking about over the next couple of months. Yeah, but that would be another way of doing it, is kind of seeing how does this relate to other spaces that make claims about the sacred, whether they're secular or sacred spaces, built about the same time. Lots of the art in here was also done by set designers in Hollywood. Yeah, but I don't know much more about it than that. Yeah.
Hugo Ballin also did the Griffith Park murals.
Oh, right on. Okay. Yeah.
So how did the building design get established? Did Bullock want this, or did he have a contest with the architect?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the architect is a guy by the last name of Parkinson, who was the architect for the large science building here on campus and helped kind of develop that Romanesque style that the campus still has. I'm forgetting the name of the building. What happened was P.G. Winnett, who's the co-founder and the vice president of the company, went to Paris in 1925 when there was the exhibition that started the Art Deco movement, went to that and wanted to build, his words, a totally new building, and drew on Art Deco. I didn't spend much time on that, but Art Deco is particularly useful for a department store because it claimed that it could stylize in a totally new way all of your life. Right? So it's a form of architecture, it's a form of art, it's a form of dress. We're talking about the flapper. The flapper is a Art Deco sort of representation. It's a way of building cars, it's a way of building trains. So Art Deco is kind of everywhere, and it becomes really useful for commercial culture. So that's how it happened. So they came back, said, we want an Art Deco store. They talked to Parkinson. I don't know whether there was a competition. That I don't know. Yeah. But it was really generated by that 1925 exhibit, whose name I'm not going to remember, in Paris. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped your hand. Not really, but okay. It's a terrible teacher thing.
I wanted the perspectives. I don't have the authority of, oh yes, you know me, come on.
Even more reason for me to call on you.
As this building is now a relic of the past
Yep.
itself,
Yep.
how has its rhetorical function changed?
Right. So it's now a law library.
Completely different.
Yeah. So in the 1960s or 1970s, Bullocks was bought by Federated. And it became a number of different department stores over the different named, branded department stores, and it came to look more like a department store. Many of the wonderful features were covered with drop ceilings and the sort of things that make it easier to display stuff. This is a terrible building for selling clothes in a world where you go to a rack and find it yourself. It's a great building for buying clothes in the 1920s and 30s, where you would say, I want a dress. You would go to the dress shop. They would model the dress for you. You would buy the dress. It would get delivered to your home in Pasadena a week later. It's not good for other kinds of, it's not well designed for that. It's also poorly designed to be a law library, to be perfectly honest. You have stacks, I was just there the other day, I have stacks of books going around, you want them in a line, right? They're going around pillars and stuff. It makes no sense, but Southwestern law has long been in that part of LA, and when this was kind of going down, Bullocks Wilshire finally closes in 1993, partly due to the LA insurrections or riots, depending on your politics. And about that time, Southwestern Law buys the building. They move into it. They were originally going to put classrooms in it, and then faculty said, no, we want our offices in it. Hey, have you ever heard that before? Yeah. So,
Actually,
just a few minutes ago, right. But it doesn't. But my analysis really works better in 1929 than it does in 2014, which is why I placed it there.
Knowing what it is now, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, right. It's an interesting question, though, and I want to frame this one other way. One of the reasons why I did this paper was because I kind of want to get back to it and maybe 20 years later publish the damn thing.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.